Well, welcome everyone to our final Kavli conversation on science communication of the semester, of the spring. I'm Dan Fagan. I'm a professor of journalism at the Carter Institute here at NYU and the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program and the Science Communication Workshops. We're able to do these conversations thanks to the generosity of the Kavli Foundation. So our deep thanks to them. You can watch all of the Kavli conversations anytime you want at journalism.nyu.edu/KC, which is also where this conversation will be archived later this week. So I'm really excited about this discussion tonight about science podcasting for multiple reasons. Mostly because while I'm an appreciator of podcasts, I don't have a good understanding at all about how they're put together. We all know that this is a booming area of science communication right now, and that right now is a pretty interesting moment in the evolution of podcasting because it's becoming so institutionalized right now because of its success. So it seems like the right time maybe to look at podcasting as practitioners like the three who we'll hear from this evening find new audiences, much bigger audiences, but hopefully without losing the spontaneity and the personal feel, even a kind of a DIY feel that has made them feel so fresh and attractive to so many people, including me. So when I decided that doing a Kavli conversation on science podcasting was a good idea, I knew exactly who I would ask to organize it and moderate it. Rose Eveleth is a total force of nature. She's a writer and a producer who focuses on how people interact with science and technology. Most of you probably know her from her wildly successful Flash Forward podcasts, which explore possible futures and are just so damn interesting and entertaining. And now, in her copious spare time, Rose has written a Flash Forward book. So check out that book immediately. And of course, when I knew Rose best, she was a student, really a prodigy in the program that I directed at NYU. It feels like yesterday, but Rose, it was actually 10 years ago, amazingly. Before I turn it over to Rose and have her introduce our esteemed guests, Janina and Emily, I do want to remind everyone that we're going to be using the Q&A box today for questions. So please use that, not the chat box. Put your questions in there, and Rose and I will both keep an eye on them. And when Rose feels the time is right to work in questions, she will do that. And so with that, I will turn off my screen to avoid distracting everyone and turn it over to Rose and to Janina and to Emily. So take it away, Rose.
All right. Thank you so much, Dan, for inviting me. Thanks to everyone who is here. To answer the question that is in the Q&A currently, I do not believe there is a way for you all participants to see each other. I think it is set such that we see, you're sort of going to see us. So you can make whatever faces you want at whatever we say and no one will know. You can eat, you can do whatever you want. So when Dan asked me, to put together something, I sort of immediately knew who I would ask to come be on this panel. So it's really exciting. I'm super excited to have Janina and Emily here. I've been a huge admirer of their work for a long time, and science podcasting is both a small world and a big world, and it sort of feels like it's growing in cool ways. And so being able to talk through all of this stuff with these two is super exciting. I will run through their illustrious bios so you can have a sense. If you have not checked out their podcasts, I'm not going to play audio for you in this session. I sort of figure we'll just chat and y'all can check out these podcasts on your own time, later on. I will put links to both of the podcasts in the chat at some point so you can get them and everything. But Emily Kwong is the reporter and host for the NPR Daily Science podcast Shortwave. Before joining NPR, Emily was a reporter at a community radio station in Sitka, Alaska, which sounds incredible, and was doing stories on like fishing boats and volcanoes and all of this stuff. She's got awards from the Alaska Press Club, Alaska Broadcasters Association. She was with WNYC's Radio Rookies, and then also a podcast called a show called The Modern Story in Hyderabad, India, which is also, I'm sure, a very cool learning experience to be working on that. And if you've never heard Shortwave, it is a really cool daily science show that sort of takes on a little bit of what's in the news and then also sort of like stuff that's off the beaten path and tries to kind of like mix it up, do creative things. It's always really funny. And we'll talk a little bit about humor and the way that we use humor in science podcasting and all of that stuff. So check out Shortwave wherever you get your podcasts, as they always say in the end of podcast credits. Also, we have Dr. Janina Jeff, who is a PhD trained geneticist, TEDx alum, STEAM advocate, podcaster, Afrofuturism enthusiast, just like really cool person. Gina is the host of In Those Genes, which is an award-winning podcast that uses genetics to decode the lost histories of African-descended Americans through the lens of Black culture. In Those Genes is an incredible show. It's been featured on tons of publications, IndieWire, the New York Times. I won't go through the whole long list. And in the early days of the pandemic, In Those Genes made an episode called Dat Rona, which sort of was made, I think, in 3 days, if I'm not mistaken. Kind of the team saw, and we'll talk about this probably, myths arising in the early days of the pandemic around this idea that like Black people were immune to the virus and some of these other sort of ideas that circulated. And that episode won a Third Coast Audio Festival award recently and is incredible. And the show has sort of continued to be a resource for folks about the coronavirus as well as other topics beyond sort of just genetics and sort of descendants questions. So again, I'll put links to both podcasts in the chat. But thank you so much, both of you, for being here. I am so excited to talk. One of the, we chatted a little bit by email about sort of like what within science podcasting would be like a fun thing to talk about, right? Because it's sort of a big topic. And the thing that we landed on that we'll sort of talk about today is the question of sort of like the people who make these shows and sort of the personalities behind them. And I wanted to start by asking both of you, one of the things I love about both shows is that they have a voice, they have a point of view. Like you are people, you're not like informational delivery machines, right? Like, just in your shows. So I wanted to start by asking both of you if that came really naturally to you when you started working in audio, or was that something that was hard to figure out? And maybe Emily, let's start with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And I gotta say, and I will answer your question, I feel kind of shocked that I'm here because Janina Jeff, you have a PhD, Rose has an MS, and I have like a PhD in feelings. I really like could not have come to this position from a less science-based circuit. And I say that because I assume a lot of people are here from the science journalism program at NYU or from Kavli, and that's great. But if you're here and you're not someone who like knows anything about science, I think that there is like an appetite and space for science communicators who can appreciate the work of scientists and like hold them up. And that's really what I do on Shortwave. I love getting like really hyped about scientists and being like, you do such amazing things, you need to be understood and appreciated like all the time. So the question of did it come naturally to me? I would say it's only because I came from the world of journalism. I came from the world of community radio. In my previous job, I was broadcasting to 10,000 people on an island in rural Alaska, reading them, I'm not kidding you, like the weather report or the school lunch menu. It's like basic. And obviously the tide table is kind of a dry read, but you got to make it interesting. You got to pepper it with a little bit of like oh, it looks like it's going to be a beautiful low tide tonight. You can comb for beach treasures, what interesting things you can find. You can gather some kelp and harvest it for your dinner. I mean, that experience of being a member station reporter in Sitka, Alaska, gave me the on-ramp to developing personality. Like, I have a personality, to showing my personality on the fly when I'm now hosting and reporting for shortwave. But I think that my route here is a little bit different. And I'm curious for you both. I mean, coming from kind of science, how that was for you, because I think that's a really good question.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk. I think a lot of people thought it would be, uh-oh, did I freeze? Can you see me?
You're frozen, but we can hear you.
Yeah,
Okay.
we can hear you.
I
Your
don't know.
beautiful voice.
Okay, let me try again.
Yeah.
Zoom is, I don't know why it's giving me issues. Can you see me now?
You are gray square.
Okay. Well, as long as you can hear me, I will continue and troubleshoot next. So I would say, I think a lot of people assume that this came natural to me. I think it's really important to talk about like the really uniqueness part of our show is that we don't try to communicate science the way that is traditionally communicated. And so the reason why it took me a while to find my voice is because I spent my entire career code switching and talking and speaking about science through a very academic, traditional lens, which is, you know, the people who created it, right? And so it has almost been like, not to say that, so it's kind of like I'm combining two different languages and also using two different parts of my brain. And I kind of describe myself as a geneticist. And really what I'm describing is this double consciousness that I've dealt with my whole, you know, scientific career, where it's W.E.B. Du Bois coined this in his experience is you're having two Black experiences at the same time. And one of them is one that you kind of put forward in white America that has been taught to you to survive in whatever field you're in. And the other is kind of like your cultural personality. And so bringing these two things together was really difficult because I got a lot of pushback on the fact that I was bringing these two things together because it was foreign. It was foreign for people in my community, even scientist friends who were Black. They were like, well, I don't know if you should curse during science. That just feels, I don't know, you're going to get in trouble. Like they were legit afraid for me. And of course, I then began to develop a little bit of a fear of like, well, what will people in the academic community think about this? How will they receive this? I joke and say, like, a lot of my colleagues in science, I was afraid for them to listen to the podcast. It was like, they're going to really, like, they knew that I was Black, but they're going to be like, oh, like, we didn't know, like, because they've never seen that side of me. So it was really difficult for me to become comfortable with being myself. And that sounds really weird to say, but it was the first time that I can bring my personality to my professional world. And so that was a challenge. And then not to mention, I had not ever recorded a podcast before 2018. So while I do a lot of public speaking, podcasting and hosting a show is a completely different ballgame. And so it also took me a while to kind of like figure out what are my natural tones when I'm going through a script and how do I, you know, what is my speed reading? I actually had to do host coaching, which I'll never forget the first time that I recorded. So for those who don't know, I got into podcasting through the Spotify Sound Up Bootcamp. And after that, I had, you know, just started to record the podcast and I naively went into the studio at Spotify with my lead producer, Sam Riddell, who is amazing. And just was like, okay, I'm just going to do this on the fly. And it took us like 2 hours to get through 2 paragraphs. And I left wanting to cry because I was like, oh my God, I'm failing this thing that I think I know so well, which is genetics, but I was actually just new to hosting. So it took a long time for me to get through that. And I think our first pilot episode is probably over 30 hours of tape, just to give you perspective. And it's only a 45-minute episode. So it took a long time for me to get there, but I made it. All right, I'm going to troubleshoot.
Yeah. I want to come back to that a little bit, just in terms of like any either like tips you might have, or like even just like what got you over some of these humps, right? Like I think all of us, even non-podcast hosts, anyone who has recorded their own voice and then had to listen to it has that moment of like, oh my God, is that what I sound like? Which I think is universal, but like finding your, there's a lot of conversations always around finding your voice and, figuring out what that voice is going to be also on the show, which doesn't necessarily have to be your exact voice, right? Where there's, you're kind of playing a character in some ways when you're a host, I think in general. We can see you now, which is great. Yay. But do you have like, like what got you over that fear of maybe of your colleagues, seeing that or hearing this? Like, was there anything that helped you get over that?
Definitely Sam. I don't know why. Every time I talk, it freezes. It's weird.
That is weird.
Let me try. Oh, did it switch back? Oh, it turned off the good work internet. Hold on.
But you sound great though.
Okay,
So
I will just
Perfect.
continue talking. I would say I never really got over the fear. Really, before the show. And that was because I was sending it to friends and colleagues, and I was sending it to people who are close to me, and I was not getting positive feedback, but then I was getting reinforcement from the team, Sam and another good friend of mine who's a creative director on the show, Chris, who just kept saying, we just have to stick to who we are. We have to stick to our culture. And so doing that, and it wasn't a whole bunch of support, but I knew that I just had to trust that instinct and rock with it. And also I, talk about this in therapy too. And if it fails, that's okay too. If people don't like it, that's okay too. I would be okay with someone not liking it, but me knowing that like I was being my authentic self and I could walk away feeling good about that.
Yeah. Emily, was there any moment where you felt like you had to recalibrate? I know, going from, community radio in Alaska to NPR is like big, like change potentially, or did it not feel that way?
No, it was a huge change. And I also feel like my last answer was a bit of a cop out because I don't want to remember ever feeling like I can't do this. But of course, I've had many moments of feeling like I can't do this. Why would people listen to me? And I think that people who are scientists, who are interested in science communication, they're like, I don't have a brand. I don't have a persona. That's for the Bill Nyes of the world. A lot of our images of science personas are white, male, curly hair. Like, I don't know. It's just this like very specific, even Miss Frizzle kind of fits in that category. My hair is straight. Like, I'm half Asian. And I never saw an Asian science communicator who was entertaining or, bringing their full humanity to the work. And so I had this natural personality at KCAW, and I was a part of the community, and I lived in the place where I was reporting. Like, coming to NPR, I did suddenly feel like I had to come up with a persona. And I kept hearing that when I was in the building. Well, I don't know if anyone here listens to, Morning Edition, All Things Considered. They have a sound, and that sound is like completely non-accented English. It often sounds like it came out of an Ivy League institution. It sounds very East Coast. This is like kind of the stereotype, but it's kind of real. And I think NPR as an organization has really evolved and brought in so many more hosts who sound like not those things. But it doesn't mean there isn't still an expectation for people to develop a bit of a persona, because that's what makes you worth listening to. And there's this like gap of like, well, what is that? And I've had a lot of conversations. What I've done, honestly, and I think that if you're considering getting into science podcasting, what Janina said about sending what you make to other people who love you, not people who don't care about you, people who have your back so much that they'll give you direct feedback. Your mentors, your professors, your siblings, whatever, send them your stuff and ask them, like, do I sound like me? Because they'll know if you're faking it. And they'll also, you can also say, do I sound like me? And also, does this make sense? Because maybe you're not in science. I think that feedback from people who love you to both like provide critique, but remind you can do it is a really powerful like combination. And like, I love hearing Janina talk about Sam, the producer, because that relationship with your colleagues, podcasting is like, it's like being in a kitchen at a restaurant. Like everyone's making different parts of the meal and it's so collaborative and integrated and you lean on each other. And shortwave would not be possible without it. I sound like I'm just saying a cliche, but the reality is that my producers will tell me in my ear, Emily, you sound really low energy. And so what I do is I like stamp my feet really hard. If you want to pick up your energy while taping, start stamping your feet on the ground or going like this. If you need to calm down, I do alternate nostril breathing where I go like on one side, on the other. With time, you'll develop the internal dialogue that's like, ooh, you need to like mellow out, or ooh, you need to pick up the energy. But until you get there, other people are going to be your ears for you and can provide that feedback for how you sound. Because I think that takes time. But you give yourself the time, give yourself the permission to not be perfect at something, you know?
Yeah. Is that harder being at NPR? Like, you know, it's a little easier perhaps for me who puts out an independent podcast or where it's like, okay, it's fine. I don't know. Like, does that feel harder?
Yeah. I mean, I think, I don't know how many people like listening to this even like have independent podcasts or listen to independent podcasts, but I think that's where it's at. Like, it's so much more original than a lot of the stuff coming from institutions. And it's so much harder to get funding. So I get why people go with like going with an institution. I mean, within NPR, you know, I feel like shortwave is this little like protective world within what I call big NPR. I in all caps, I call it big NPR. So surrounding yourself with people who really like understand you and what you're trying to make can help maintain the integrity of your voice within what might be an institution that might want to, you know, right size you, whitewash you, standardize you. I mean, there's so many ways of talking about how we can make very different people all sound the same. And that's like really sad. So I like independent podcasts a lot because like you listen to Flash Forward, you never hear something like that anywhere else. Or like Ologies, you know, and these are just like ways of talking that they haven't been like, you know, so yeah, I feel it, but I also have a layer of protection. I'm very lucky.
Yeah.
I'm really, really lucky.
I mean, that's sort of, to me, what makes shortwave work is like the rapport you and Maddie have. Maddie's one of the other hosts, and like yes. the like jokes and just like the humanness of it. Like, yeah. And like the bad jokes, the good jokes, the bad jokes that are good jokes. Yeah. Like, and it feels as though like that is, you know, what makes shortwave different from, I mean, like it also is a daily show, which has its own positives and negatives, which I'm sure you can talk at length about at some point. But yeah, like sort of having that, bringing people in, and Ologies is a great example as well of a show that does such a good job of like just being so personality driven and like, so you just can't resist kind of in some ways, like listening to Allie, who I'll put a link to that as well in the chat to Ologies, because it's a great shout out to that show. Janina, do you feel like your hosting has changed since you started? Like in terms of like, when you hear early episodes, are you like, who is that person?
Yes. Okay. I don't know Zoom. I don't know. Every time I talk, it just freezes.
It's so weird. Well, we can hear you still.
Okay. So, yes, I definitely, especially because now we're deep in season 2. And I can hear the difference of myself from episode 1 to the end. And of course, I get more comfortable with the topics, but a lot of it wasn't recorded so far away from each other, like time-wise, even though it comes out pretty spaced out. I get more comfortable, but there are still, and especially we just finished a few episodes for season 2, and I've let a few people who care about me listen to it. And the response is, wow, you sound so much more natural. It just sounds like, you know, I can tell the difference with this season versus last season. So I'm definitely a lot more comfortable and I can hear the differences. I've also gotten a lot better because I was really bad, guys. And so now, you know, both Sam and I, when we're doing reads and we're recording, we know like little things that I have a list, for example. And so like, I didn't realize how bad it was. And we know certain words that we have to avoid and certain words that we have to spell out, and very particular about pronunciations. And so making sure that we get all of that right. So I can definitely feel my comfort level. That's not to say, I remember a couple of weeks ago, we were recording for season 2, and it took me about an hour to get through a paragraph. And what we learned was that recording late at night is not a vibe. So we switched our recording sessions to Saturday mornings, which complete fresh energy. So I can tell, and Sam and the rest of the team can tell when I've been tired. So definitely.
Yeah. I know that when I go back and listen to first season stuff for Flash Forward, I'm just like, oh my God, you know, like, who is that person? Like, who did I think I was trying to be? Like, it was just like, I don't know. I like didn't trust myself in many ways to like, let it be weird in the way that like now the show is. And there is that like element, I think too, of like learning to trust your gut and like let yourself be the thing, like say the thing that you kind of like the joke you'd make with your friends, like let yourself just make it, you know, on your show, because it's your show and you can actually do whatever you want, which is like the nice thing about
no one has to understand.
Right, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
I feel like
ahead, Emily.
what I'm learning about people who are career scientists, and I really like Maddie's taught me a lot. Maddie has a PhD in microbiology. And I'm just like, that seems like academia is very intense. And they really, I don't know how to put this because I've never been in it. I mean, I really say I did not pursue higher education after college. I mean it. But I hear the impact that master's and PhD programs have on people trying to be science communicators. They're afraid to make that joke. They're afraid to show their personality. They're afraid to show vulnerability. And it's just so interesting to me because as a non-science person, I think we've all been wanting scientists to show more of their humanity. And we've seen a lot of that with the coronavirus pandemic and how different public health officials have really like found a way to communicate information. But on climate, right, that's often been the critique, is that climate scientists had a hard time for like several decades in the 20th century, like really finding a way to connect the information emotionally for people. And I think that there's something about how science is taught and like the gatekeeping around science that makes it, I don't know, do you feel like it's hard to break out of the patterns of talking that you're taught in science?
Yes. like
how did
really,
you do that?
The podcast is really, and I don't know, the video the podcast is really about me unlearning and finding myself too. Like it really, although I'm telling stories not about me entirely, it really is me also learning to be very uncomfortable. It's a very uncomfortable place trying to just be myself, where I've never experienced a level of safeness and to be myself, you know. So it is, and then academia, I don't even know where to begin, right? So
it's like, I mean, if you don't have data, you're nobody. Is basically what I've learned about academia. Data or nothing.
Yeah, not only that, like I was in academia, PhD, and then did a postdoc after that and was like actually going to do a professor, like I was going to be a professor. And then like right before I was about to get this big grant, just said, actually, I'll just go work in biotech. And everyone was shocked because I was the one who was supposed to be, in the lab eradicating disease. And I do it in a more indirect way now, but I suffered from a lot of rejection in academia. Like I wrote a lot of grants and they all got rejected. And when the Spotify thing came along, a friend of mine told me about it. And I was like, what? I listened to podcasts, but I was like, I don't know. And I did the application, which was like a short 2-pager. Mind you, I got a lot of rejections from papers, from grants. And this application pool was 18,000 people. And I was one of 3 winners. So when I won, I was like, okay, I'm going to pull the stats out and show all these people at the NIH, my odds were slimmer. And, I think I'm okay at grant writing. So yeah. But no, I mean, really unlearning has been my journey through this podcast experience, that being a truth teller and being fact-based does not have to sound the same way that we are taught. And so kind of unlearning that has been a process for me. And one of the things we do on my show a lot is we make analogies. And so try to fact check an analogy where there's no example to really fact check it with is, it's not easy.
Yeah, the just from like the middle ground here, where I sort of feel like I thought I'd be a scientist, decided to not be a scientist, and did SHRP, which is sort of the NYU program that has sort of helped facilitate this conversation. Even in that context, I think that in podcasting, a lot of the time, and I think Ologies is actually a really good example of this. And thank you to Elizabeth who put a link there in the chat to Ologies. The thing that is hard for a lot of people, particularly folks who thought they might be scientists or folks who are science adjacent even, is sounding dumb and being wrong on tape. And both of those things are crucial for a science podcast, like in the sense that like you have to ask the question that is like kind of silly. Like you have to have, you have to ask the scientist the question that the average person needs to know. And even when I teach, students, or when I like teach podcasting to folks who are really interested in science, they're so afraid of looking dumb in front of a scientist that they won't ask the question that you need to ask. And in print, this happens too. And you can kind of often write around it, or you can do a follow-up email, or you can kind of like explain your way out of it. But in audio, you can't really do that, right? You kind of need to ask that question, and you need to be able to just like kind of sound dumb on tape and like have that be okay. And I think Allie Ward, who does Ologies, does such a good job of this, of just like asking like absurd questions, but that are like very genuine and like, just like, wait a minute, like, how does that work? Like, I don't understand that, like asking those questions. If in the interview, you don't understand what the scientist is saying, guaranteed nobody listening is going to either, right? And you have to be willing to be like, wait, what? Like, and just like kind of do that thing. And I think it's really hard for a lot of people, even if they're not scientists, but people who are like afraid that the scientist is going to think that they're not smart, or like just overachievers in general, which often is the pool from which many like journalists come from. And like that, I think in the context of talking about podcast personality, feels like a thing you have to kind of unlearn as well, even if you didn't go through the PhD program. It's like being willing to kind of just be like, kind of, yeah, like dumb on tape. And like people in the world are going to hear you ask that like dumb question, because like they also have that dumb question and they don't want to be the ones to ask it. And you kind of have to like keep that in mind, I think. And that actually brings me to sort of a question that I wanted to ask both of you, which is, when you're crafting your shows, thinking about audience, right? Like thinking about who you're talking to, right? Because that dictates a little bit of what your personality is going to be on the show, is thinking through like, who are you talking to? So I'd love for you both to actually talk a little bit about who you picture when you're making something as the audience, and then maybe how that impacts your sort of hosting and the way you craft episodes.
I'm afraid to talk because my video is gonna freeze, but I guess it's just we got a whole system here now. So I will say I had to step away from when I hear artists talk about they don't watch their work or they don't care, they don't read the comments, and they just kind of stay really really siloed into what they want the art to be. I had to do that. So in the beginning, I thought I was going to have this, big show funded by Spotify. So it was like making what I wanted and then also trying to tweak that so that someone else would like it and pay for it. Cause also I don't have any money and I'm poor. And I think Sam deserves to live well. And so how is this, how are we going to do this? And how can I make this marketable so that someone could fund it? But I actually think the show became better when I realized I don't care if someone funds it. And like, I'll eat ramen noodles and give 1 million talks just so I could pay for the podcast, which is literally what I do. So like my perception changed, but the audience originally I thought was, kind of like, well, this is a show for anybody. And it is a show for anybody. We welcome anyone to listen to it. But I am making this show for Black people. And for me to even be okay with saying that, because it makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable to say that I am actually making this in mind with people who are my age, who look like me, or maybe my grandmother, and asking those questions. So I could completely relate to the point where you made, where you said, I feel like this question is going to be dumb, or I'm going to sound dumb. I deal with that too, and I tell everyone who works on a team that you're all scientists too. And when we speak to people, we kind of have two kind of interviews we do. One is kind of like a community-based interview where we actually encourage that questioning. And we try to create a safe space where no question is dumb. There's been some times where we had to I've laughed at a question like, wow, I think it was a coronavirus. Someone talked about putting a blow dryer to their face. But anyway, but being okay and accepting that it's okay to make something for Black people. And it's a very loving thing to do that. It's a very loving thing to make any type of intentional artwork that everyone can enjoy. And I think once I realized that, I really started to embrace, culture. I really started to embrace and really expose how beautiful our culture is. And reminding myself, when I say something that's very culturally relevant, that I don't have to explain it, because again, I'm making this show for an intended audience that I welcome everyone to listen and enjoy.
And your use of analogies, I was listening to an episode where you were comparing how companies that figure out ancestry, tracing it to a specific tribe in Africa, that lineage resembles like a hip hop song. And you said like the beat is the same, but the hook and then the verse provides like layers of information for people to figure out where in the world and the continent they are. And I was like, this is just brilliant. It's brilliant. It's so artistic. And when have you ever heard a scientist explain it like that?
Thank you.
It's done clearly with like so much love. I don't remember what the episode was called, but
it was
I remember hearing it and being like, this is so smart.
I mean, it's so funny because I thought that episode, I love that episode. And I was like, oh, this episode is going to be the best episode. Everyone's going to love it. Because when Sam and I were coming up with the idea, I was like, oh my God, this is just so cool. But that episode, we wanted to highlight, the whole first season is about direct-to-consumer companies. And we wanted to highlight Black-owned direct-to-consumer companies. And so we did a hip hop battle. And so
right between two companies,
which was really fun.
You do also data like 2003 style and versus a more modern genetic
old
sequencing.
School and the new school.
Yes.
And that episode and that story originally changed. Like when we were making the season, it was like, man, this is really dark. It's also really hard for us to make light of like really dark things. But in that episode, I remember us thinking about like, how can we explain finding your tribe? And then I think it was Sam Kim was like, let's explain it in a hip hop song. And then our music producer, who's just a friend of mine from college, but he's super talented, he already had a song lined up. It has nothing to do with genetics. It's actually like a birthday song. Like it's probably played in a strip club somewhere. So I have to like edit it when I present it to like kids. I always take little clips anyway. But yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I mean, doing things like that, I'm always worried that particularly the science community would say, well, why would she, do something like that? And just being okay with like accepting the fact that everyone may not like it, but my intended audience will feel safe and feel comfortable and hopefully will learn something.
Yeah, Emily, how do you think about audience for shortwave?
Well, I think that I wasn't there when shortwave was piloted, so I wasn't a part of its like creation story in the same way. I think Rose, you clearly like, created flash forward in your mind or in those genes with Janina. But I think what drew me to the show was the idea that it could be a show for people who didn't know that science even cared about them. Especially, I think like in addition to doing science storytelling differently, there's also evolving science, period. Like one thing that's really cool about In Those Genes is you're acknowledging that a lot of the earliest science involving genetics was developed by people who were extremely racist or advanced eugenicist ideas. What do you do with a history like that? Where do you take it? It's so painful, and it would make a person even not want to listen to that podcast because they're like, oh, I don't want to listen to anything involving genetics, not after knowing the history. But like it's so radical when we can take this thing that and kind of like look at it and take it away from those parts that are harmful and violent and make it a discipline that is truly meant to serve all people. And I see people doing this across the spectrum in science. I just did a story on skin of color dermatology. So my dad, love him, Chris Kwong, he has eczema. His eczema is not textbook eczema. It's not red because he has kind of a darker skin tone. It's more like purple. So there's this precedent in dermatology where images of darker skin tones showing eczema aren't in the textbook, meaning doctors misdiagnose or underdiagnose. And that's led to health disparities in dermatology that are well documented. And I wanted to report on this. I wanted to report on the way that dermatology hasn't been fully reflective of all the different skin tones. And I also wanted to not make it this like heavy thing. So I decided to interview 3 Black dermatologists who have been pushing the field, one for decades and 2 more recently, who are kind of like ideological descendants of Dr. Susan Taylor, who is this dermatologist at University of Pennsylvania. So I interviewed her. I interviewed Jeanette Okoye, who heads up the dermatology program at Howard, and Jenna Lester, who's a dermatologist out in San Francisco. And I put all of them together. And by them telling their story, you can hear where they're taking science. And I think that that is a kind of like service to a science audience, because you're not just like giving them information, you are evolving their understanding of what science is and who it serves. And you're being honest about its failings. You're being honest about how it hasn't really taken care of all people. Medicine, I guess I'm talking about in this case. And sometimes listeners are going to be offended by that. Like we didn't, I'll never forget this, and then I'll stop talking, but we did an episode on perimenopause. And the thing about menopause that I didn't know until I did this story is it can like come on quite early, like earlier than people think. And it can result in all kinds of like hormonal changes. People who may be predisposed to anxiety and depression can suddenly experience it during perimenopause and have no idea what it is. They're like, why am I suddenly very depressed? It's because perimenopause messes with your hormones. So did this whole episode just really unpacking like myths about perimenopause. And we get this email from a listener, and we have a general audience, right? It's NPR. It's like science for everyone. That's like so intimidatingly large and impossible. So we got to be like, what are we really doing this for? This episode is for people who experience perimenopause. It is for them. And this listener did not like that. So we get this email that's like, excuse me, are all of shortwave listeners women? Because why would you make an episode about perimenopause? Why would you, are they all women? And I was like, are they kidding with this email? Like, is it possible to imagine a show hosted by female-bodied people who would make an episode that didn't mention men and really wasn't for people who experience perimenopause? And we were very intentional about the episode to say people, because there's people of all different gender identities who experience perimenopause, and some who experience it hormonally but not physically. You know, it's very complicated. So we were really intentional about that. And like, so this listener, Maddie was like, I can't. And I said, you know what? Oh, someone in the comments is like, men can benefit from learning this. That's exactly what I said to this listener. I said, you know, you think it's not for you, but I think it is, and here's why. If you can understand perimenopause, maybe you can be a better son to your mother, or a better brother to your sister, or a better friend to your friend, or a better partner to your whomever. And it turns out this listener was like a teenager in college. And they wrote back, I'm so sorry. I didn't even think about that. Like, I'm a teenager in college. I don't think he was expecting me to write back. He was kind of like, oh no.
Someone reads my emails.
Someone read my emails and was like coming back at me. And so I bring up this story because, like, I agree, you got to protect yourself from, you got to maintain your vision, and you have confidence in like who you're making things for. And also, some listeners, like, they're not there in the journey, they don't get it. Fine, you don't have to engage with them. And sometimes though, when you do, they really surprise you because they just hadn't thought about that. But I do think you need to protect your energy and know when you have space and time to do that. Like, I was in a good mood that day. I thought it was hilarious that someone wrote that email. But if I was in a mood where I was like really down on, I don't know, the patriarchy, I don't know. If I was, that's a word that also makes people uncomfortable. I said the patriarchy in an episode and we got all this pushback, and I was just like, wow. But in that day, I felt like, you know what, I can have this conversation with this kid, and he turned out to be a young, you know, man, and maybe he'll grow up thinking a little differently. Like, I don't know. That's not my responsibility, but.
The funniest thing to me about that story is that Shortwave is literally a daily podcast. There were 4 other episodes that week. To be like, wait, excuse me.
Yeah, we can't say we don't. Like, just
probably the one yesterday was like about physics. Yeah, like,
oh my God, that is so true. See, that's like, and if I'd been in a different kind of mood, maybe I would have written a different kind of email. But I was like,
yeah,
this information could be helpful to you.
This touches on something I do want to talk about, which is like, when you are the host of a show, you are very like public facing, and especially for these shows where like your personality is a big part of it, right? And like you're performing some version of yourself, you know, wherever. How do you two think about like boundaries in terms of like, these are things I don't talk about on the show, like these are things I don't like, you know, there's a weird parasocial relationship that a lot of listeners have to podcast hosts where they feel like they know you personally, but like they do not, right? Like, we've never met, like, and you know, I get these emails from Flash Forward or like people will say things and I'm like, that's really sweet and you're all very kind, but like, remember, we aren't friends. Like, we don't know each other, right? Like, you listen to me and you know, I sometimes will talk about things that are happening, but like, there is a weirdness to this thing that we do. And I'm curious how you two think about just, yeah, like setting those boundaries and sort of like navigating that sort of weirdness as you make your show and sort of like engage with the audience.
Go ahead and get prepared for the freeze.
It's like Vogue.
Yeah, so you guys get to see this beautiful picture my friend did for me. Anyway, so boundaries. Yes, I actually for the first time recently had someone approach me in public, which was really weird because it's a podcast. You know, you think people don't really know what you look like, but then they Google you and they find you. There are certain things that I don't talk about. And I think for me, I try to keep any type of, I try not to use the words right and wrong in the show, because, you know, that can go down a slippery slope and people will start to, you know, say and do things. I'll never forget when we were making the vaccine update, I was writing about anti-vaxxers and their fear of autism. And I'll never forget kind of like the language I was using was painting this picture that being autistic was a bad thing or a wrong thing, and trying to have this conversation and getting pushback from Sam, like, let's reshape this because this is not consistent with the way that we think and the way that we talk, because we can't in a genetic show say being who you are is a bad thing. Some people don't have a choice when we're talking about this. So just like never saying something is right or something is wrong. So that takes a lot of like my personal opinions out of things. We also do not touch religion. A lot of people, or when I say religion, because when we're talking about genetics, people like to say things like, this is what God gave me. And it's very easy to use some language that could be offensive and hurtful to people who have different religious beliefs. So we try to stay as agnostic as possible in that way. But I think people do assume, you know, that they know you. And because Rose and Emily, you're such cool people, they do really want to be your best friend, you know, the intentions are well, right? But then it also becomes overwhelming as a person who already has friends and already has a community. Not to say that I'm always down for new friends. I don't care what Drake said, but like, you know, trying to set those boundaries and realizing I'm also Southern. So I'm from New Orleans, and I feel very weird about not replying or, you know, responding to every DM, and just trying to figure out, well, how can I do this, you know, not lose my Southern values, so to say, but also set a boundary of like, hey, I actually don't have the bandwidth to go through all these questions, but if you know, come and talk to us on Thursday, I would be happy to answer those questions. Or if you feel strongly that we need to address this, I'm going to make sure that we address it. So that's kind of been what I do loosely.
Yeah, Emily.
Yeah, I feel like kind of new to hosting something like this. I've been at NPR since September 2019. And so I'm still getting used to it. But I do remember being in Alaska and like running in 100-degree fever at the grocery store and people coming up to me to be like, your story on the public works department was a little, and I just like, I'm sorry, I can't talk about this right now. Like, it's those boundary setting things. And I do have a lot more. Janina, you said something earlier about like how you realize like why creators don't look at comments, and like you didn't understand that before. I think I do have more compassion for anyone who puts themselves out there anytime now. Yeah. And like sometimes I decide to put myself out there, but I have control over how much. And so for instance, we did an episode this last week that was reported by, we have a lot of other reporters on our show, like from the science desk. Ritu Chatterjee came on to talk about how to help someone who's having suicidal thoughts. And this is a topic that hits very close to home because my mom is a suicide attempt survivor. And I've talked about it before publicly. I'd already kind of shared it publicly, so I was prepared to do that, but I hadn't shared it with shortwave listeners. And I really went back and forth about whether I could host this episode, having this life experience, which more and more people are having actually, but we haven't reached a point where people are talking about it a lot. And I said, you know what, if anyone hears this and it just makes it more personal to know that the people having the conversation, it's not like a theoretical concept to them. And so I called my mom and I was like, I think I want to mention at the top of the episode that this is really important to me because of you and our relationship. And she was like, can I think about that? And I was like, of course. And so she thought about it and I was fully prepared for her to say no either way. But she said, okay. And then we actually like co-wrote the like 2 sentences that this meant. I mean, it's like 2 sentences. And that's a way that when folks listening here start their podcast, when you want to put yourself in the story, or even if you're wondering how to navigate the personal and professional boundary, just know you do have control over how much, what you say. And if anyone puts you in a position where you are being like asked to give more of yourself, you do have to practice saying no. Like I said yes to Rose when she asked me because I wanted to do this panel because I really like Rose. But if it had been someone else and I like maybe didn't trust them, I'm serious, right? Like you can say no. You can be like, you know what, I don't have the bandwidth. I don't want to, you know, but I'm really glad I'm here with you all. I'm just saying, I'm giving you permission. This is your permission slip to say no to things, you know, especially if you're going to be like talking about stuff that's like you've researched, it's your specialty, it's so personal, it's so like you're putting yourself out there. You've already put yourself out there enough. You don't owe listeners, I don't think, much more, you know, unless you're being paid for it. Yeah.
I just wanted to also talk about that episode that you listened to, Emily, the rap battle episode. There is one of the biggest themes that was around my show was that I've never taken a consumer genetic test. And part of the story as to why, and we're going to try and tell this story throughout the season, was because I had a really bad experience with a man in science. And we took the interview, and I mean to tell you, I have never been so afraid in my life to just talk to a person who I had met before. But long story short, this man had made a pass at me when I was in graduate school. He's several years older than me. And I don't think he even remembers that or the way it made me feel. And I'm telling Sam about it. And we're like going back and forth on if we're going to ask him if he remembers that experience and see if we can have a conversation with him where he might apologize, but also might be a dick about it. And kind of like to mentally prepare for that. And so I had a very similar experience, and we actually didn't put it in that same episode because the episode was really dark already. And we were like, oh, we don't want to like villainize him. But also, you know, we actually spent the rest of the season deciding if this story needed to be heard, and eventually decided yes. And it was more of like similar to your experience that I felt that sharing the story and that conversation with him was bigger than me, and that it could be potentially life-saving for someone else. And I also found it was very healing for me. But then, you know, after you say something like that, you got to prepare yourself for what could happen after that, right? And that's where you have to set that boundary of kind of like, well, these are the things that I'm comfortable talking about, and these are the things that I feel a little bit unsafe in certain spaces to talk about. So I'm just agreeing with you and feeling that same experience.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. I mean, yeah. Because yeah, the bigger than me thing is a real, like we're lucky to even have that platform, and also it's not like it doesn't affect you on the other side of it when you go to bed at night and you're just like, oh my God, I don't want to get up because I'm scared of looking
that
at my
experience,
email.
Emily, of that guy who emailed, like, I think many people don't realize that like those emails just go to our inbox, right? Like we see them, right? Like, I think that especially, and probably more so with NPR, because you think you're just emailing like some, giant company, but even, I do try to respond to many of the emails that I get, and like people will be like, oh my God, I got a response from Rose. And part of me is like, there's literally no one else here. Like, there's like, I don't know who else you're going to get an email from. My dog. Like, I haven't figured that out yet. Once I figure that out, then yes. But like, yeah, like it's just sort of funny. But I do think that people are so used to just firing off stuff, even like tweets, and like don't think you're going to see them, or don't like remember that like we are people who have feelings and like might see your thing on a bad day, right? And like might, like just sort of that like setting boundaries for yourself as to like, I'm not going to respond to this email actually because I don't have to. And then also like figuring out where you want to use your energy and like for what and for who, and like, who deserves it and who doesn't. And like making all of those calculations that are always really challenging as like a host person. It is an incredible privilege. And it's like, and some people are like, oh, don't complain. Like you get to host a show. Like, like you're not allowed to complain about these things. It sometimes seems, but like it's also hard on the other end, right? That like, we do indeed read the emails that you send. Like, just remember that. Like, I feel like is the one thing I'd love for people to remember is like, yes, a human reads those emails like when you send them. We have about half hour left. I want to make sure I get to questions that people have been putting in the Q&A box. And just a reminder to folks, if you have questions, there's a little Q&A button to put them. If you can put the questions in the Q&A and not the chat, that'll be easier for me to just pull them. So just try to do that there. We talked about this a little bit, but Elizabeth asks a little bit about that beta audience, right? When you're kind of like sending things to people, either before a show launches or even just kind of like running ideas by people. How do you pick who to share with, and sort of like, what do you value in that kind of like beta audience?
I will say having very different perspectives in that group actually is the biggest thing. Like no one has all the answers. Yeah, and people who are thoughtful. What about you?
I am a person who loves to be critiqued. I blame academia because I'm like so used to like
Right,
the negativity.
reader 1, reader 2.
Yeah, like
reader
I have to have
3.
3 reviews and they need to be bad, or else I feel like, wait, something's wrong. I'm insulted when I get something back and it's not read. I'm like, you didn't even read it. You don't care
You
about
sound like
me?
Maddie. Oh my gosh.
What do you mean you didn't think you thought it was great? How dare you? So So I know when we made the pilot episode, which was actually the same year of the Spotify competition, I sent it out. Of course, I made a Google survey because I needed to look at numbers. I'm a scientist, and like I needed to get the feel. I had to read all the comments. I would never do that now. So now I want to get all the feedback. I want all the feedback. I had to learn really quickly. You don't need all the feedback. I think I had over 100 people listen to the pilot episode before it became public. And I was dealing with all 100 of that feedback. Ironically, a lot of the people who love and care about me were really nervous. They were like, oh my God, Janina, like, I don't know about your safety. If you use the N-word in the podcast, no one's going to be used to that. People are going to be, hearing all these things, and then also then trying to make these really difficult decisions on who to listen to. And I kind of learned that when it comes to being wrong about a science fact, I'm going to definitely listen. Or if it's challenged or if it's misleading, I'm definitely going to make sure that I address those things. But when it starts to come into like things that are a part of our culture, then I try not to. I actually got feedback from Spotify after listening to the pilot episode that I needed a race expert because I was talking about racism. And I was talking about racism, and I am a scientist. And I was like, at the time, okay, fine. Like, I mean, I know plenty of race experts, but sure, okay. So I added a sociologist to that episode that was not originally scoped out. And then after I did it, I was like, yeah, that wasn't really good feedback because I am not a race expert. I always tell people I'm not a D&I expert, but I am a person with a lived experience with racism. And I am not a show that is teaching the history of racism or any type of sociology. I'm actually talking about my experience and then taking my expertise of genetics and putting it there. And so even feedback that come from experts, in the field, you have to kind of like weed through it. And what I do is, when we get feedback, I run it through the team and say, what do you guys think? And usually Sam comes back and is like, we're good. They'll get over it. We'll put a disclaimer here, maybe we'll change the language here, but we really listen to our gut. And I'm glad that we did that because I think it shows.
Yeah.
Also, what's helpful with feedback is if you're doing it in like a Google form, let's say you're sending someone an audio piece and you're like, can you listen to this? Give them a Google form with like the 5 things you want feedback on. Like be very specific. Maybe the bottom one is like anything else I missed, but popular questions are like, what were the most interesting parts for you? What were the least interesting parts for you or the most confusing parts? Were there any areas that felt like really contrived or like, it's just the things that when you think about like, this is the show I want to make and this is who I want to make it for and why. So what kind of feedback would I want to make that show? I mean, that's all very internal work. So you want to give your feedback people, like they're not in your head. So help them out, like give them, can you listen to this for X, Y? And I think that helps too.
Yeah, that's such a good idea. Cause otherwise you get feedback and you're like, oh, you
This is
like
not
got
helpful.
stuck on this like weird thing that like, yeah. And it's like, especially if you're
Right.
giving it, and you should be giving it to like non-journalists in your life or non-scientists in your life or whatever. And like, they're not trained to give feedback, right? Like they're not sure what to be listening for. It's a win-win situation where like they feel like they are able to help in a way that helps you also. Maureen asked a question around finding a niche in science podcasting, right? Like there are many podcasts, there are lots and lots and lots of podcasts. There are many science podcasts. Like, how do you figure out where you can find kind of your channel in that world? Emily, do you know? I mean, I know you weren't there when shortwave like first started, but like, I mean, to choose to do a daily show, right? Like that is already kind of like you're trying to look for a target, like what do you know what the conversations like that were around?
Yeah. I mean, I think because I was a daily journalist, and I think I've changed too. Now I'm more like, what would it be like to make things not on a daily schedule, things that are a little more thoughtful. But I think, for me, what I liked about daily at the time, you have to figure out 2 things: your niche, and then also the format, and then also the timing. Like, are you a once a week person? Are you a once a month? Are you a whenever I want? Like what's realistic? And then also, what kinds of conversations do you want to have is the question you need to answer to figure out your niche. Like, I'm trying to think of a science podcast that has a specific focus, but like I got one. How to Save a Planet. How to Save a Planet is a podcast about climate change, but climate change solutions. Those people decided, I want to make a climate change podcast. I want it to be long form. I want it to come out once a week. And yes, they went to Gimlet to make it. So like independent versus institutional. And I want to talk to people about climate solutions. And how you get that niche is you ask yourself, like, what kinds of conversations am I interested in having? And maybe what kinds of conversations am I good at having? And maybe that's because you have the professional background. But like I said, I didn't have a professional background in science. So I say that, but like sometimes life leads you in interesting places. So I would ask yourself, it's like that Annie Dillard quote, like how you spend your hours is how you spend your days, and how you spend your days is how you spend your months, your years, your life. So like, how do you want to spend your days? Who do you want to talk to? What do you want to think about? Rose decided she wanted to think about the future, and Flash Forward was born. So I think that's how you develop a niche. It's actually way more of an internal job than like having the right resume. Maybe some people would say I'm wrong, but I think it sounds more passionate and authentic. And it's also really hard work. So why wouldn't you want to talk about things why would you want to drag yourself into this work if you're not going to talk about something you're interested in, Yeah.
I don't have much to add on to that, except for like I already felt like a weird niched person, and I like
Yes.
embrace that. So I love underground hip hop. I love like that artist on SoundCloud who has 5 listens but is so dope. So I kind of envision myself being that same person, and so it's just kind of like, I like, our show is like an underground hip hop, artist, that talks about genetics. So genetics is already very niche. And I think when we were, trying to go the institutionalized route, we were really nervous because we talked with the Gimlets, we talked with Spotify, and saying, hey, we have a really small, like we're going to focus, it's not a science podcast, not just a Black science podcast, it's a Black science genetics podcast. And actually, we also want to make things even more complicated and expensive and throw a lot of music in it too. Because that really is how I am. And so that came really natural. I feel like the thought of the show was already niche, but just like you said, you as an individual, I'm gonna go on a genetic spin here. You as an individual are already unique, right? And so like there is no one out there that is exactly like you until CRISPR comes. No, I'm just kidding. But like there is no one out there who is exactly like who you are. And so try to embrace, well, what are those things about me that really make, when people think of my name, this is what they think of. And I really hope that people hear that in our show. Like when they hear our show, they're like, this is in those genes. This is how they are. So I couldn't agree with you more. I think really listening to yourself, embracing who you are, and that even is a hard process, but it really helps you figure out that niche.
I love thinking about you as like the SoundCloud rapper of podcasting. That's such a it's the perfect image to me.
And genetics is the super niche. Like it's a small community, I've learned.
Yeah. I think that like just to like plus one everything that has been said, so often people will ask me like, how do you start a podcast? And the first question they'll ask is like, what microphone do I want? And I'm like, it does not matter. Like if you don't have a show idea, then you like, there's no, like the nicest microphone in the world, like literally doesn't matter. I would rather listen to like something that someone recorded on their iPhone that has like a good idea behind it than like the fanciest microphone, but you like don't really know what you're doing. An exercise that I always try to get people to do when I teach like podcasting is, coming up with that format. And then also like, if you can't list 10 episodes that you would be excited to make of the show, if like that's hard for you, then like probably that's not the right idea, right? Like
So good.
at some point you need to be able to like, it's not like you have to have them off the top of your head, but if it's like really a struggle for you to like come up with 10 specific episodes and even like who I would talk to for that, or like what, like what it would sound like, and you can't hear it in your head, then, one of the things that you see in podcasts a lot is sort of like lots of people start podcasts, but it's actually pretty hard to maintain a podcast, right? To keep it going. And that's for a variety of reasons. It turns out podcasts are not as easy as everyone likes to say in various podcasting like media, where they're like, it's easy, just turn on a mic and talk. Sure, you could do that and no one will listen because it will not be good, right? Like, and so thinking through kind of like, what do you want to spend your time thinking about? What do you think you have to say that's different from other people? That's like sort of, you're not hearing a bunch of. And yeah, like, spoiler alert, you're probably not going to get super rich off podcasting. So like, you better like what you're doing. It's kind of the like, I know everyone talks about how there's big money in podcasting right now. And like, that is true for a very small number of people who already have a lot of money. And so like, you kind of really have to be willing to like, do something that you have to really like it. I mean, I feel that way about like journalism in general, though. It's like, it doesn't pay that well. You get laid off a lot. You better like it,
And like come up with that like alternative definition of success. Like Rose, you have a book, but you must have measured success in many other ways prior to these like common social markers of success. Like even unpacking the ways I talk about science, Janina, that's like a marker of success. Like it's your own definition of like, why am I doing this? And how will I know that I've been doing, do you know what I'm saying? Like coming up with your own metrics for success, I think is really important, because like I cannot impress upon you how correct Rose is. It is really hard to make a podcast that's good. It takes more than you think it does. Yeah. And if you really want to sustain, I mean, you could do a one-off series and just 4 episodes and try it. But yeah,
Yeah.
I don't know
Yeah.
how you're
And I
doing it.
think, you know, also asking yourself, and this leads into another question that is I see in the
Mm.
Q&A that I want to lead into, which is like, why do you want to do a podcast? And like literally, which seems like a very simple question, but like if the answer is just like, it seems like everyone's doing podcasts, and so I feel like I should do a podcast, like that's not a great answer, right? Like it's sort of like there has to be a reason why audio is a format that you are excited about for whatever reason. And actually kind of leads into a question that Ethan put in here about like what the medium of audio enables sort of in the work that we do. Like, you know, it would be maybe potentially even a little bit easier to just like write a blog post or like write a story, and like making it auditory is hard in a lot of ways, like we discussed. What do you two think sort of like about the value add of audio, or why make a podcast for your work in particular? And like, how does the medium shape a little bit of how you approach storytelling in each episode? Janina, do you want to start?
Sure. I will say for me, I feel like I podcasting so talking about genetics, talking about this hard thing, and we had to start at a really hard place, right? We're basically telling people like, hey, you don't even know your background, and we have to tell you why you don't know it, which is a really dark story. But genetics is a very personal thing. And so I really saw podcasting as being this very personal experience. Most times you listen to a podcast by yourself. And so it's this really like safe space for you to have this experience all to yourself. And I thought if we're going to be doing this individual personal journey that listeners are also taking along with us, what better way than for them to be with themselves? So that answers the podcast question. The audio question, I mean, I am an audiophile, so I absolutely love music. I think, Rose, I told you, I love all your plants. I name all my plants after rappers. Like I am, obviously you see this picture with me and speakers, obsessed with music. So I just force everyone else to be too. No, I'm just kidding. But I really, I also know how important music is to the Black community, and how it actually has been a tool for survival, a tool for lightness in very dark moments. And so I immediately knew that a podcast is the best way to people to connect directly with the music. When you think about watching a movie, I mean, I pay attention to sound design in movies now, but I don't think a lot of people really pay attention to it. But one thing that does happen is music and audio creates a feeling, even if you can't see it. And so creating this feeling in a very personal space, it just felt like what can be a more ideal space than this? And there are genetic shows that are like TV shows and that kind of thing, but how can we make this one personal? And we wanted to make sure that we weren't creating a genetic show that talked about Beyonce's DNA, right? We wanted to make sure that we were creating a genetic show that people felt in touch with. And so the music part of it, I also like not being seen. I don't know if I hear a lot of men who do like every man who has a podcast and wants to give me their unsolicited podcast advice. And I don't know if you guys have this experience. They're always like, you should do video. I'm like, what? So I actually also really like the fact, what better example than my video networking, that I don't have to be on, video and people looking at me. So
Yes, I feel like I love the not being visual. Although I will say it's weird to be recognized when you're a podcaster because like you don't think of people knowing what you look like, and so when it happens you're like, I'm sorry, like what? But I was at a bar and the bartender came over and was like, "Are you Rose?" And I was like, "How did you know?" And she was like, "I recognized your voice." And I was like, "No." Like, that's not like,
Oh, her ear is really good.
yeah, it was so good. Yeah. And I was just like, man, I mean, she was super chill about it. It was very cool. Like she wasn't weird. But yes, I was just like, man, yes, there is some, like, I always joke that being podcast famous is the best way to be famous because no one really knows what you look like. Like Ira Glass can just ride the subway in New York and like people don't really know what he looks like. And so it's just like it's the best way to be like media famous because like people sort of don't know what you look like. Emily, how do you feel about like audio medium and into sort of like storytelling?
I mean, I have nothing. That was beautiful. I have nothing to add to that. Like I'm an audiophile, and I think this is like, I also was like into audio in before Serial, right? I was like making, so it's been it's been really interesting. I mean, it's given great job security because in 2010, when I was like, hey, to my parents, they were like, ooh, okay, sure. And then, you know, now look, here we are having this conversation. So it's certainly becoming more profitable than it was before, but yeah, I don't really have anything to add. I love musical theater too. Like, I love improvisation. I love spontaneity. I love the weirdness of people, and audio is great for that because people don't care about what they look like.
Yeah.
And there's like a, man, you can just, people can just, I love that. I love that. I really don't like video. I don't. I just know that about myself. So what I would say is, if you're trying to figure out your media, is to, again, think about where you feel most comfortable expressing yourself. I think print is the other one. I love writing. So video, you know, was never even like a consideration, honestly. But, and also fact checking in audio. I want to make this clear. You still got to fact check, even though it's audio. There's been a lot of conversation around podcasts being somehow this like loosey-goosey form of journalism. It cannot be further from the truth. And I like, these shows are all fact checked. These 3 shows, like, we are looking at the information. We're like not putting in quotes that are wrong. You know, we're, I mean, just so you know, if you're to do science communication, you got to get your facts right. So I just want to say that it doesn't like absolve you of some kind of rigor just because it sounds like fun and spontaneous. Yeah. Right?
Yes, no, totally. It's so funny because like in they're like, there is a type of media executive who thinks like, ooh, we'll just add podcasts and that'll be like fun and cheap and easy.
Yes.
And we'll just like whatever. And
Like,
you're
it's
like,
fluff.
cool. No, it's not how it works. Yes, that is definitely a very real thing that is happening in our industry, and is not great. Because I think there is this sort of myth that it's easy to make a good podcast and that like all you need is a mic. And it's like, I guess like, it's sort of like, oh, it's easy to be a runner because all you need is sneakers. Like, running is hard, right? Like, you can't, like, people say that all the time about running. And it's like, no, running is actually quite difficult. Like, being like a good runner is hard, right? Like, the sneakers is not the thing. Like, that's not the mediating factor here. Okay, we have 6 minutes. So I'm going to do a couple of rapid fire questions. I want to make sure we try and get a couple in here that we've missed. Okay, I feel like I can very quickly answer the question from NW about recommendations for where to post job listings in radio audio. There is weirdly a listserv that is like, was the New York City very small listening club, and is now sort of the de facto place where people post audio jobs for some reason. And this is sort of another indicator of, in my opinion, like how young podcasting is and is as an industry, which is that like the main place to post jobs is this like random listserv that you have to just get invited to. That like, I feel like I can say this because I am a podcast dinosaur and was like literally there when that listserv was invented. Like, I was like in the room when that listserv was like made on a computer. It's a Google group. When we used to have like 10 people over in someone's living room to like listen to podcasts and discuss them and like be nerds. So if anyone, just to like, as a general PSA, and I say this all the time because I do think it's a problem that this is an invite only group, like list that you have to know about to get into, email me anytime and I will add anyone to the list. Like, it's ridiculous that it's closed. Like, this is like an access issue and I hate it. So my email is available on my Twitter. I could put it in the chat. If you want to be added to the listserv, just send me an email. I'm happy to do it. So that's that question.
Also, I'm going to put a plug for Air Media, which
Yes.
is, so the Association for Independence in Radio is great. Just go on this website, and I don't think you can post jobs, but you can find resources for making your own podcast. Airmedia.org is great. Other ones are Transom. It's got a lot of articles, NPR training. These are kind of like my 3 go-tos for just if you want to start reading about like the gear side of it or the distribution side of it, or connect with people. It is a lot of networking by email, but I think Air Media,
Yeah.
can you post a job on Air Media? Or
I
is it
don't think
just,
so. It's a
I don't think you
directory of
can.
people. Yeah, it's a directory of
Right,
people.
it's a directory to find people.
Yeah, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. And Transom is great, especially if you're like trying to start out. Like they have a whole series that is in both English and Spanish that does like how to start a podcast 101. And there are like 5 parts to it. And it's like gear, RSS feeds, like all the technical backend stuff that you might need to figure out. There's a really good resource on Transom that Emily very kindly just put in the chat if you're looking. Okay, I think we have time for one last question. And I want to do Chitana asked about making science more accessible by using analogies, which we sort of talked about a little bit. And I guess the question is like, how do you come up with analogies basically? Like, how do you boil these like hard, complicated, nuanced questions down into something and grapple with like, even if like a scientist might super nitpick, like technically that's not this, that, right? Like, you know, which they always do. And I'm sure you get those emails. I know I get those emails. How do you kind of like decide what's right enough to be a functional analogy for, you know, communicating to a broad audience? Janina, do you want to start with that one?
So for me, I am that person who's like, actually, this doesn't work because we didn't talk about the mitochondrial genome. And Sam's like, what the hell is the mitochondrial genome? And I'm like, wow. So I'm that person. But she'll give me pushback like, well, can we use words like most of the time, you know, or we are not committing to, you know, to date, we know, like we say, we use language in the analogy that also kind of covers us for like the absolutes, because we know scientists like myself are super nitpicky. For example, in our first episode, I talk about the genome being a bowl of rice. And I'm trying to describe the genome as being a bowl of rice. And we chose a bowl of rice because we were also trying to describe that people like share certain similarities. So we were saying, oh, well, you know, you can think of Latinx as having a bowl of paella because for whatever odd reason, everyone has their own cultural rice, right? Like, so rice is just different. In New Orleans, it's jambalaya, you know, paella. We also can, you know, talk about different type of Asian cuisines and different types of rice. So we started with rice. And then I was just like, oh yeah, and you can think about a genome of a white person as just being a simple bowl of rice, right? And I was like, wait, actually, no, that doesn't work. Like they have admixture too. So how can I change this? And I'm like, well, actually, there's a little bit of salt and pepper, you know? So we try to like fix those things just to make sure that we are describing it, but definitely the little words like most of the time, maybe what we know so far, what has been, discovered yet, we can think of this like, you know, kind of like little words like that when we're using the analogy. I would say Sam and Chris really come up with majority of the analogies. And I'm kind of, what happens is I write something super sciencey and Sam's like, what? And then I describe it and she's like, oh, all you mean was that we're just basically describing a book? I'm like, exactly. And so and so that's kind of like how we work through it. And then I'll do it too, but we have to make sure the analogy checks. So I'm the person who's like, but what if this happens? But what about this? And then what about that? And so I am that person.
I'm just gonna say that
yeah.
on the I love your and Sam's like work dynamic.
Yeah.
Just on the analogy thing, radio is a visual medium. The analogy has to paint a mental picture in people's heads. If it's like conceptual, it probably won't work. So like a bowl of rice, you know, that's one there's no absolutes, but like that's one test of an analogy working is can it paint a picture in people's minds that then they can follow your description to a place. Yeah.
Well, thank you. I see Dan has popped
Yeah,
in, which I think
I'm
means
here.
that we are at time. Good. I just want
Yeah.
to say thank you to Emily and Gina. Amazing to have you all here. Thank you to everyone who came and asked questions, really good questions. I know Dan will sort of talk about the ways in which this is available.
There it is.
Oh, that's the flash forward book is available at all booksellers. I feel like it comes out officially next week, so I have to do my due diligence and like pitch the book. So you can find out more at flashforwardpod.com. Again, Shortwave from NPR, In Those Genes. Go listen to them. They are incredible shows, like made by incredible people. And thank you all for being here. Dan, I'll let you do the official
I
wrap.
just wanted to add one more thing. And that is, I'm just so grateful to Rose for putting this together. She's a very, in addition to being such a talent herself, she's a very generous person. So thank you, Rose. Thank you so much to Janina and to Emily also. I learned so much. I felt like there was a wonderful combination of very practical advice, but also kind of an intimacy. You know, I feel like I was in your living rooms, but of course we are in your living rooms. That's the way things are with Zoom. I just want to say one last thing, and that is, you know, there's a kind of a faddishness now, the podcasting and other forms of journalism have gone through this before. But to me, the real take home today is that it's true of all nonfiction storytelling. It's not about the gear. It's not about, you know, the ease, or it's about the strength of your idea, the passion and curiosity you bring to the idea. And it's about reporting. It's about actually asking questions and checking. And that's true of all great journalism. And it's certainly true of these three podcasters. So thank you all so much. This will be available online starting maybe tomorrow, or if not the day after tomorrow, and it'll be online forever on YouTube. But also a simple way to find it is journalism.nyu.edu/KC. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you in the fall when we resume our Kavli conversations. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good summer.